session. We've got 3 very exciting speakers today, all from the psychology department and all from UL. So I'm going to, without further ado, Katarzyna, I'm not sure if I'm saying your name correctly, so I'll let you say it to the group. And without further ado, I'll turn off my camera and my mic and let you off, and I'll give you a 9-minute warning if that's necessary, just let you know that there's 1 more minute to go. Okay, good luck to everybody.
So hello everyone, I'm Kasia and I'm a final year student in the BSc Psychology course here at UL. And today I'll be presenting my FYP research on the effects of transient and chronic loneliness on depression and psychiatric distress. So first I'll give a quick background. I'll define the key terms that I'll be using and also give a quick overview of the past research. I will then share with you my methods, the secondary data set that I use, and also describe my variables, before finally sharing with you my findings and placing them in a wider context, both in terms of the research field and the wider society. And I'll also offer some limitations to my study. So just to define some key terms, you can think of loneliness as this negative feeling that occurs when you perceive there to be a discrepancy between the kind of social relationships that you would like to have and the ones that you actually currently do have. So there's this theorist called Jung, and he argues that there are 2 patterns of loneliness, transient and chronic. So transient loneliness is the type of loneliness that you would typically think of. It is associated with a specific event, for example, moving away for college, and in it you are lonely for a while, but this is eventually resolved when you form new social connections. However, chronic loneliness is a lot more enduring and long-term. Jung argues that it's loneliness that's been going on for 2 or more years, but past research doesn't really agree on the minimum amount of time you need to be lonely in order for it to be considered chronic. We also have depression, which is symptoms of low mood and not being able to enjoy things that you previously enjoyed, and this lasts for 2 weeks or more. And then psychiatric distress is a more broad range of symptoms relating to mental health in general, and includes symptoms of things like depression, anxiety, and a downturn in daily functioning. So there's a few studies who looked at chronic and transient loneliness, and they found that chronic loneliness was associated with increased depression, even more so than transient loneliness. But a lot of these studies, they looked at either college students or elderly populations, 50 years or more. So we need to look at this effect in the whole adult population as well. And we also wanted to look at symptom intensity or severity, which is why we're looking at psychiatric distress. So just to put it briefly, my research question was the relationship between different patterns of loneliness and psychiatric distress and depression? And my hypothesis stated that both the transient and chronic loneliness groups would have higher levels of psychiatric distress and a higher likelihood of being diagnosed with depression than the no loneliness group, but that the chronic loneliness group would be even more psychiatrically distressed and have an even higher likelihood of being diagnosed with clinical depression than the transient loneliness group. So to test this, I used data from the UK Household Longitudinal Study, which is a study conducted by the team at the Institute for Social and Economic Research, and they interview a nationally representative sample of the UK population every 12 months. I used data from waves 9 and 10 of data collection, which was data collected between January 2017 and December 2020. I had almost 19,000 participants in total, and they were all adults between the ages of 16 and 102 years old. So just to describe my variables and how they were measured, loneliness was assessed using a revised UCLA scale of loneliness. Participants got a score of between 3 and 9, and a score of 6 or above was classified as lonely. So then based on this, we classified groups into 3 groups. So the no loneliness group was those who were not lonely in any of the waves. Transient loneliness were the groups who were the participants who were lonely in one wave but not the other, and the chronic loneliness group was the group who was lonely in both waves. Psychiatric distress was assessed using the GHQ-12 and had 12 questions that asked participants about things like concentration, loss of sleep, and feeling unhappy or depressed over the past 3 weeks. and participants got a total score between 0 and 36, with higher scores indicating higher levels of psychiatric distress. Then finally, we had depression, which was assessed using a single question, and they asked participants whether they have ever been diagnosed with depression, with an answer of either yes or no. We also had a few control variables, which were age, gender, ethnicity, marital status, highest educational qualification, and number of close friends, and these are all related to loneliness and depression. So then, just before I share with you my findings, I assessed my hypothesis using a multiple linear regression, which is a statistical test that allows me to see an association between a predictor variable, loneliness, and an outcome variable, psychiatric distress, and it also allows me to control for other variables to make sure that the effect of loneliness on psychiatric distress is independent of other factors. So my first two hypotheses were confirmed. You can see that here on the graph, which shows the mean GHQ-12 scores across the loneliness group. As expected, the no loneliness group had the lowest levels of psychiatric distress, with a mean score of 9.51. And most importantly, the chronically lonely participants were the most psychiatrically distressed, even more so than the transient loneliness group, with a mean score of 16.2 compared to 13.13 in the transient loneliness group. Then there were my other two hypotheses relating loneliness and depression. And here again, my hypotheses were confirmed. So I did a binary logistic regression, which is very similar to the other test I did. But here, the outcome variable depression is binary, so the answer is yes or no. And the test tells us the likelihood of one group having depression compared to another. Again, I have a little table showing my results, but it might just be easier to just look at the graph, which shows the percentage of depressed participants in each loneliness group. So again, as expected, the participants in a no loneliness group were the least likely to have depression. Only 2.3% of the participants in that group had depression. And then again, the chronic loneliness group was the most depressed. A total of 13.2% of participants in that group had depression, compared to the transient loneliness group, where only 6.3% of their participants had depression. So to summarize, my findings are consistent with prior research in that chronic loneliness is associated with more depression, even more so than transient loneliness. And I also extended research on chronic loneliness and mental health by showing that chronic loneliness is associated with increased psychiatric distress, which relates to more broad symptoms of mental health. And they also showed that Jung's classification of chronic loneliness as being 2 or more years may be a bit too restrictive, because in my study, people who are lonely for 1 year or more were significantly different than the transient loneliness group. So I had a few limitations, the main of which is the fact that I had to exclude almost 50% of my original sample from the analysis, and this was mostly due to missing and incomplete data. I did compare the excluded participants from the final sample, and they found that there were not a lot of very impactful differences between them. So my results should still be quite generalizable. And another limitation is depression diagnosis, and that we didn't look at the current state of depression. However, this is also partially alleviated by the fact that we looked at psychiatric distress right now over the past few weeks. So for the impact of this research, we now know that chronic loneliness is associated with significant psychiatric distress and depression, which would of course lead to increased mental health care costs and demand. And this is worrying because the mental health services in Ireland are particularly strained right now, and also because COVID created such a perfect environment for chronic loneliness because we're so isolated. So it shows us that it is very important that we come up with interventions that will tackle loneliness in the general population and prevent it from becoming chronic. Thank you for listening.